Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. My name is Anaf Kalam and I will be moderating today's discussion. We're pleased to be joined by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who will be joining us to give us a briefing on the top events going on in Israel this week. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you should wish to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Aknaf, and good evening from Israel. There's really only one place to start, and that is the UN Security Council resolution on a ceasefire. As we know, last week, the Americans were pushing a resolution that very blatantly and directly connected any temporary ceasefire to the release of hostages. That was vetoed by Russia and China, so that obviously fell. And then there was some very heated diplomacy over the weekend to try and get something else moving. I believe it was in the end an Algerian resolution. And the whole game, if you will, was around whether they could get enough in there to make sure that the Americans would abstain. It was obviously, very ill-considered from an Israeli point of view. If any sort of resolution would not receive a US veto. And in the end, the resolution came through. It did not condemn Hamas, which is obviously a point of, is a problematic point, not just from Israel, but according to the Americans. But what the Americans felt it did do is it did address their needs, which were A, a ceasefire, and B, a release of hostages. Now, the text itself, what was considered controversial as opposed to the original American one, was there was no direct connection between the ceasefire and the hostages. They were two separate issues, even if one did follow the other. Now, in diplomatic talk, especially at multilateral institutions like the UN, words matter, sentences, order of sentences, order of issues matter. There's the extremely famous UN Security Council Resolution 242, which has been poured over now. It was passed in 1967 after the Six-Day War, and the word "the" is the most important word that was in the end left out of the resolution. Again, Google that to understand broadly what I'm talking about, because that would take up a lot of our time. But it just goes to show that UN resolutions, especially the Security Council, every word matters, every sentence matters, every paragraph, what follows what is connected to what. And the Israeli reading of this resolution was that there was no connection. It called for a ceasefire throughout Ramadan. It did mention the release of the hostages, but not in a connection with the ceasefire, which is what the Americans did, and what Israel basically got very upset about, obviously. And in the end, the US decided to abstain. Every other country voted in favor. And so the resolution passed. Now, it's important to note that this resolution doesn't really have an active content because it's not under Article 7 of the Security Council. Article 7 of the Security Council means it's a demand of the parties, and a member state has to basically adhere to that demand. It was not under Article 7, so it was more declaratory than anything else. But still, what it did do is it basically allowed the passing of a resolution which was considered by Israel to be extremely unbalanced. And the Americans, for the first time in many years, possibly since the end of the Obama administration, did not veto a hostile resolution to Israel. Basically, the Americans are claiming, and they've claimed a few times over the last 24 hours, including in a recent interview on the main news in Israel, that there has been no change of policy. The Americans found enough in it, because it mentioned those two elements, the ceasefire and the release of hostages, that they felt it was good enough from their point of view, but they could not support it, thus not voting for it, because it did not condemn Hamas. So that is their excuse or their argument for why they came to the position of not vetoing it. Clearly, not vetoing something, abstaining, is not a middle ground. It's clearly taking a position. It's clearly allowing the resolution to pass. Israel saw it as let's say, a hostile act to some level, and certainly a departure from what America has sought to do up until now, putting the hostage release really, at the highest level, considering it equivalent or equal to a ceasefire. And the two things were always connected in the American statements, and Israel basically felt that they weren't connected, where the Americans have tried to make the argument that they still believe that it was. Prime Minister Netanyahu certainly reacted very negatively to it, coming out with some, disappointed statements, and most importantly, cancelled a delegation that was supposed to go to the US this week to discuss the Rafah operation. As we know, it was going to be Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and National Security Advisor Tzachi Negbi, two people very, very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the idea was that this was the invitation of President Biden to discuss what the Americans would describe as alternatives to a mass operation in Rafah. They've talked over the last few weeks very prominently, the Americans, that they do not want a mass operation in Rafah because of the 1.5 million Gazans which have been internally placed to that region, and they feel that they do not want to see what Israel did, certainly in Gaza City, to a lesser extent in Khan Yunis, happen there. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has been constantly saying, we will get to Rafah, but the Americans wanted to try and speak to the people closest to Netanyahu to try and, what they describe as, provide other options, but also probably behind the scenes give them a warning that we will not give this a green light. We want to see a plan for getting the refugees out, getting them to safety before they give any sort of green light or even an amber light that we talked about last week for such an operation. Obviously, there will be differences of opinion, but the question is exactly how big those gaps are. Significantly, while this delegation was cancelled, Defense Minister Gallant was in America meeting with his counterpart and National Security Advisor and others. He was there really to talk about not just what's going on in Gaza, but also the north. So quite simply, he became, to a certain extent, the sole Israeli representative in the US. And that was certainly not something that Netanyahu wanted. And we'll talk about why he actually even reportedly asked Gallant to come home even during these discussions. But it's clear that Gallant felt that it was his position to fill in the gaps, to be there to speak to the Americans about what's happening in Gaza and also what's going to happen in the north. Importantly as well, this week, the hostage deal, again, there's a difference of opinion between the Americans and Israelis. Hamas returned to their maximalist position that they demand an end to hostilities, that they demand Israel retreat from the Gaza Strip, allow them to return to the north, etc., and all prisoners will be released, etc. The argument now between the US and Israel on that is whether that position hardened as a result of the Security Council resolution or preceded the Security Council resolution. What is clear is that we know that Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran applauded the Security Council resolution. In Israel, it was reported that Hamas's position had hardened as a result. The Americans are disputing it, saying that their position had actually hardened beforehand. But what is clear is certainly the daylight between the US and Israel is something which is emboldening its enemies. They're delighting in this. They're seeing that there is perhaps light at the end of the tunnel for them, especially those in Hamas in Gaza, that perhaps with a weakening of American support, what they see as a weakening of American support for Israel could not just delay the seeing off of Hamas, the defeat of Hamas in Gaza, but perhaps even the prevention of it. And that's something which Israelis are certainly worried about. But it's clear that the hostage deal at the moment is gone cold. The optimism, even by the Americans, is certainly no longer there at all. The Israeli delegation left Qatar, after being there for about 8 or 9 days, they claim that there's absolutely no one to talk to, nothing to talk about, because Hamas has taken this maximalist position. On Rafah, there's a lot of talk about if, when, how, but now there seems to be a talk about waiting till the end of Ramadan to go into Rafah. There are voices in Israel that say that Israel has perhaps missed their window of opportunity to go into Rafah because of the build-up of international consternation, the American objection, and quite simply also because Hamas have embedded themselves in with every day with greater strength in Rafah. And so there are those in Israel who are starting to think maybe it's no longer possible to go into Rafah. These are sort of quiet voices on the side, but perhaps they're going to grow over the next few days or few weeks. Interestingly enough, if you would ask anyone around the world what is the greatest challenge to this Israeli government, they would certainly talk about the failures of October 7th, the war in Gaza, whether it's going well or not, perhaps what's going on in the north, etc., etc. But it now is very clear that the biggest threat to this government, a very real threat to this government, is the ultra-Orthodox enlistment law. We've talked about this a little bit in the past, but tonight, I would say, is the last moment that the Israeli government can present a law to deal with the ongoing deferment of ultra-Orthodox Israelis, ultra-Orthodox Jewish Israelis, I should say, from the army. As we know, since 1948, there was an understanding that ultra-Orthodox community would not serve in the army. At the beginning, it was only a few hundred. Today, it's tens of thousands. It's an issue which the Supreme Court a number of years ago said that the Israeli government has to deal with. It's unfair, it's unequal. And since the beginning of the war, there's been an understanding that the Israeli army is understaffed, can't rely on technology as much as they thought. And a couple of weeks ago, this all blew up when the security forces or the defense ministry basically said that we have to draft a lot of people immediately who still had another year. We're talking about non-ultra-Orthodox. We're talking about also extending the service of Israelis who serve. We're talking about extending the amount of time that you have to do in the reserve. And that created a well of anger amongst the non-ultra-Orthodox population in Israel, that they would have to do a lot more, whereas a whole community, a fast-growing community, would not serve at all. And this really changed. October 7th has changed a lot of people's minds about this ongoing deferment. And it's now got to the point where there are growing voices amongst those who would never dream of touching this issue in the past, who are saying we will no longer accept this situation. Not only do we hear these voices in the Religious Zionist Party, which usually stayed out of it, but also from within the Likud party, we see problem. And we see that Yoav Gallant, who is the defense minister, is certainly against any proposal that has been put up by Netanyahu over the last couple of days, like allowing the deferment of ultra-Orthodox Jewish Israelis until the age of 35. The idea there was to basically make it so long that many would just give up and go to the army, and all sorts of other ideas. The fact is that the Attorney General of Israel, Gali Barahav Miara, who is considered certainly by the right or by Netanyahu's camp as being an enemy or being a problematic challenge, let's say, she said that she could not accept any of these proposals, first of all, because she characterized them as not serious. There was no quotas, no numbers, no figures, no dates, nothing. It was just a lack of seriousness. So she's already said that she cannot support it. She gave the government until later tonight to come up with a proposal and then have it passed by April 1st. If there is no law, and it doesn't seem at this point that there will be, on April 1st, in theory at least, ultra-Orthodox Jewish Israelis can be drafted. And those institutions of learning can receive economic sanctions. Now, that is going to be a real problem for the ultra-Orthodox parties. They have already threatened that this could be the end of the government as a result. But there are people on the other side who say that anything short of serious enlistment law will also be the end for them. We saw this week Gideon Sa'ar, with his 4 seats, remove himself from the government. He's out. Benny Gantz has said that he could leave, and he will leave, if this issue is not sorted out in a way that he finds equitable. Also, Yoav Gallant says that he will not support any law, and as Minister of Defense, he's obviously a very important character. But the date that people now are thinking is June, that if a law is not passed by then, the end of the summer Knesset session, we could see elections. Now there's even talk about an understanding, a deal between Gantz and the ultra-Orthodox parties that Gantz would agree to no immediate deferment or sanctions in exchange for election date 6 months from now. So that could put things off. The reason that the ultra-Orthodox want that is because they want to at least get next year's budget for their institutions of learning passed, and then we can go to elections, and then they can at least have a bit of space before elections and government coalition negotiations, etc., etc. But it seems, and I was in the Knesset today, and I spoke to many people, that this is really a very serious danger and challenge for this government. It could be weeks, it could be months, it could be 6 months, but it does seem that the clock is ticking. And remarkably, in the middle of a war, and potentially another war in its north, and all the challenges that's having socially, etc., that this government could be felled over the ultra-Orthodox enlistment law. And with that, I'm happy to go to any questions.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for that update. The first question we have comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, we know from the media how Prime Minister Netanyahu reacted to the United States abstention from the UN Security Council resolution. What is the attitude of the rest of the War Council in Israel?
Well, the War Council, I mean, what I think the Americans maybe understand, maybe don't seem to understand, is whereas there is a lot of dislike and distrust of Netanyahu in the general population, but certainly in the war cabinet amongst the likes of Gantz, Gallant, and Eisenkot, they certainly don't disagree with Netanyahu any policy issues of substance. Again, I'm putting the ultra-Orthodox deferment to the side. I'm talking about the issues related to the war. So they pretty much support, they hold the same position as Netanyahu, that this is a problem, the fact that the US did not veto. They do not necessarily support the tone of response or the way of response, the way Netanyahu chose to fight this openly. The Americans have characterized it very much as, Netanyahu doing this for internal purposes. I have said on many, many occasions over the last few weeks that everything that happens in the US can be seen through the prism of the upcoming elections. Well, I have to note tonight, certainly regarding what I said towards the end, that pretty much, and it's actually been true for probably a few weeks now, a lot of what's coming out, let's put it that way, especially from Netanyahu, but others, can now be seen through perhaps the prism of upcoming elections in Israel. Because, as I said, whether there will be in the end elections this year or not, certainly there is a feeling that there is a strong chance of elections. So there is a feeling that Netanyahu is very much trying to play to his base, or to his more hardline right, by thumbing his nose a little bit publicly at the Americans. That's certainly not what Gantz has done, even though he would be equally disappointed by the lack of US veto. So I think it's the way that it was done, rather than any disagreements, on what the Biden administration did at the Security Council.
Thank you. To follow up on that, we have a question from Judith Hershon. How does the US and, if I might add, Israel evaluate the fact that Hamas thanked the United Nations essentially for their decision and for the United States' abstention from the Security Council resolution?
Well, Hamas didn't thank the Biden administration or the US for their abstention. They congratulated the passage of the law, which they welcomed. They certainly didn't, give any credit to the Americans, at least not publicly. The Americans, to the best of my knowledge, I didn't see anything. I saw Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran welcome the passage, and obviously they give credit to those who wrote it, those who drafted it, and those who fully supported it. As we know, the Americans did not support it. So I did not see anything specifically from Hamas. I can't imagine Hamas would openly welcome the American administration. Perhaps I missed something. But certainly, again, that plays into, I think the majority of Israelis are, that Hamas gained from this. It's emboldened them. They're seeing daylight between Israel and America. They're seeing a tiredness, or this is what they perceive as a tiredness on the American side towards Israel, whether it's because of elections, whether it's because of a moral position, whether it's because of evolution of their position on the war. Irrespective of that, Hamas certainly would be delighted to at what they saw at the Security Council this week.
Alrighty. And Judith has just chimed in. My apologies. She said Hamas thinking the UN, not the US. My mistake.
Right.
We have a question here from Len Getz, who asks, has Netanyahu been invited to address Congress either by House Speaker Mike Johnson or both Johnson and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer?
I doubt Chuck Schumer would be inviting him anytime soon. But on Johnson, I did hear today that is something that they're very much looking at. And again, I should say that I heard this from Israeli politicians, not directly from anyone involved in American politics. But there does seem to be some interest on the part of Johnson to invite Netanyahu. Again, this is the reading from certain Israeli politicians. The question is, if that would happen, if there was an invitation, it's clear that Netanyahu has already accepted. I think probably at this point there are discussions ongoing whether Netanyahu wants to go that far, because as we know, he's sort of done this before with the Iran deal. But I think probably at this point, again, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, he would probably have to gauge whether this would win him support in Israel or whether it would actually harm him, because let's not forget Netanyahu likes, or has in the past, likes to talk about his relationship with world leaders. He used to talk about his relationship with the American president. I mean, that at that time it was Trump. And obviously that soured over the years. He used to like to talk about his relationship with Russian President Putin. Obviously that has soured, and that's a little bit, has to move to the background. But the question is whether this would work for Netanyahu electorally or politically. It does seem that the Republicans want to invite Netanyahu. It would work for them probably politically and electorally. So I think there is interest and there is some outreach, but it's not certain yet what the decision or the answer will be yet.
All right, thank you. Another question from an anonymous attendee, not directly related to the topic du jour, but are there worries in Israeli leadership circles how to sustain the fight against Hamas if the US begins to limit military resupply? What are Israel's plans if this happens?
Well, that's the big issue. I don't think there'll be any situation where America will openly either limit or stop supplies of weapons. The question is, what we do know is there are many, many ways to send messages. There are many, many ways to slow things down. Perhaps they need to be reviewed again. Perhaps they need to go through another application. Perhaps the level of weapons will be lower. I mean, we've already seen countries like Canada and Italy basically said that they will no longer supply arms to Israel, but these countries constitute an extremely minor amount of what Israel requires. Obviously, if America were to do anything on that level, that would be highly significant. There is a worry, especially, as I said, with in an election year. The Americans publicly are saying that this is not going to happen. But as I said, it wouldn't be an official statement or official release. I don't envision that under almost any scenario. But again, there could be many ways to send Israel a message, or even just to tie its hands a little bit. If they're not happy, for example, if Israel does go into Rafah and they wanted to slow it down, perhaps they could slow the almost daily deliveries of arms to Israel, certainly certain types of arms. And again, all they would have to do is delay it a few days, then that would perhaps send the message enough for the Americans. So I don't see any official sort of statement or any official policy. But the worry is what could happen unofficially, and that is a big worry for many Israelis in the security and the political establishment.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Carrie Hillebrand who asks, excuse me, why can't or won't Israel get on top with orderly food distribution to at least North Gaza to lessen the growing international condemnations and the public relations disaster?
Well, Israel has said many times that it's not limiting any of the aid distribution and is actually helping and assisting, whether it's by air, by sea now, or even from many of the borders. The problem with coming in the north, what we've seen is that the trucks have then been attacked by Hamas and basically requisitioned by Hamas. And also, let's not forget that Israel doesn't want to see civilians in the north because it's still trying to clean up the few remaining pockets of Hamas resistance there. So it doesn't want to see too many civilians. It wants to push as many as possible further south in Rafah, where there is ongoing, I don't know if I'd use the word plentiful, but certainly regular aid. I mean, we've seen images of, post-fast feasts where there is quite a lot of food. There's no possible problems there with aid and distribution there. But in the north, certainly it goes against Israel's policy of trying to move everyone away from there so it can disrupt the last remaining Hamas pockets of resistance there. But it is still allowing the aid to come through. But again, there's a problem. How does it bring it in? If the Israeli army itself would march it in, obviously that would be a major problem, and there would be open targets. Allowing them just to come in an orderly fashion has also proven problematic because there's been either stampedes or Hamas gunmen have shot anyone coming to try and get it. So it's a real catch-22 situation for Israel. It's damned if it does, and it's damned if it doesn't. But it is trying as much as possible. It is said that it's not, with security measures in place, it is not limiting any level of humanitarian aid, regardless of where it comes and how it comes into the strip.
All right, thank you. Here's quite a big and maybe open-ended question. Alex from Brazil asks, what are, in your opinion, the best, worst, and most likely endgame scenarios for Israel?
Wow. I mean, we've got another half an hour. I mean, the best case scenario is that it fully defeats Hamas, or Hamas surrenders, release of all the hostages, which unfortunately is not a likely scenario unless Israel really forces Hamas to do so, or it releases them through its own operations. The worst case scenario is leaving Hamas in power, is allowing the international community to force some level of either retreat or permanent ceasefire, and allowing Hamas to rule in the strip. That will be seen as a tremendous victory. And while Hamas will be certainly weakened and won't necessarily be a threat to Israel, a significant threat, at least immediately, what this will do will give a massive boost to Iran and its proxies around the region that Israel is weak enough or not strong enough that it can defeat probably the weakest of all of Israel's enemies. Hamas, at the end of the day, regardless of what they were able to do on October 7th, are still the weakest, in comparison with Iran itself, in comparison with Hezbollah and others. Hamas is not one of Israel's stronger enemies. And if Hamas is left standing at the end of it, it will give a massive boost to other extremists led by the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has certainly destabilized the region further and will also weaken the West because Israel is seen by Iran. Let's not forget, they repeat it again and again and again as the little Satan. Israel is seen as the little Satan. America is seen as the big Satan. So that means that the goal is eventually to get to the big Satan, which is America and really the West as a whole. Israel is only seen as the first step. So if Israel does not achieve a victory, is not able to defeat Hamas, Iran will certainly get a great boost, not just in its so-called quote-unquote defeat of the little Satan, but also certainly a bloody nose to the big Satan, and would embolden and incentivize these radicals to really go much further in the next round, which will mean thrusting itself as it sees itself, not just a regional power, but a global power, and it will thrust itself onto the global scene in a way probably unprecedented up until now.
All right, thank you. Now, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our podcast. I wish we could get to all the questions that were coming in, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you again, Ashley, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for our viewers, please be on the lookout for our email over the weekend with our upcoming podcast offerings. And before we go, we would also like to remind our viewers and listeners of the Middle East Forum's upcoming policy conference celebrating our 30-year anniversary. It'll be taking place from May 13th to May 15th in Washington, D.C., and will feature policy panels covering Israel victory, confronting the threats from Iran and Turkey, countering Islamism, reforming Middle East studies on higher education, and more. You can sign up under the Activities tab on our website at meforum.org or by sending an email to events@meforum.org. We hope to see you all there. We thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.